All right, so in class we've been talking about how England has been going down the path of constitutionalism with the English Civil War. Today we're going to look at the flip side and look at France and look at how the foundations for French absolutism was established. Since France, eventually we're going to talk about Louis XIV. We're not going to start talking about him today, but we're eventually going to talk about him, and he is the absolute ruler that every other ruler wishes they could be. So the first question we're going to talk about is how did Henry IV rule France? So now if you remember, Henry IV is Henry of Navarre. He was the one that came to power as a result of the War of the Three Henries and the ending of the French Civil War. He was the one that said Paris is well worth a mass. So Henry of Navarre wanted to try to take away the privileges of the nobility. And he targeted what you have in France, which are called the regional parliaments. Now, these are different than Parliament in England, because Parliament in England is more like a legislative body. In France, and the spelling is slightly different as well, the parliaments were kind of the local government, and the local government was ruled by the nobles. And he wanted to target the parliaments and take some of that local power away from the nobles, so they wouldn't have so much power in the countryside. So he targeted the old privileged groups, the tax exempt. Think about what we already know from AP World and about the start of the French Revolution, that a major problem for France was that large portions of French society, or large portions, I should say, of wealthy French society, did not pay taxes. So he targeted the old privileged groups, the tax exempt, and the people who were basically preoccupied with protecting their own self-interests. So basically, he wanted to try to regulate the economy he wanted to try to regulate the economy more so as well after the religious and civil wars that France had. His finance minister was this guy here, the Duke of Sully. And the Duke of Sully and and himself established government monopolies on gunpowder, on mines, and salt. So this way they could kind of build up their resources so that they can combat the powers of the old nobility. They built a canal system linking the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. And the way that they did this was through something called the corvée. The corvée is a labor tax, the royal corvée. So it was a national labor force of drafted workers, and these workers had to basically work for free to improve the roads and the conditions of internal travel. And in some ways, Sully and Henry IV were a little bit ahead of their time. What they dreamed of was organizing Europe into a politically and commercially common market. So they kind of had foresight into the idea of the EU. Now we also know, though, that Henry is going to be assassinated by a fanatical friar, and is not going to rule for as long as it might have been thought that he would have. So he is going to be succeeded by his young son, Louis XIII. Now, Louis XIII, when he becomes king, is only 9 years old when Henry's assassinated. So that means that he's obviously too young to rule himself, and this man here, Cardinal Richelieu, is going to be basically the guy who's ruling for Louis XIII. You already read in class the Political Testament, kind of showing Cardinal Richelieu's views of government. So you already have a little bit of background into how Cardinal Richelieu thinks. So basically, when Henry IV dies, his wife, Marie de Medici, is in regent for her son, who's 9 again. She felt she was really in a vulnerable position. So a couple of things that she did is she agrees to what's called the Treaty of Fontainebleau. This was in 1611. This was a treaty with Spain, and it made a 10-year mutual defense act with Spain. She also agreed that Louis XIII would marry the Spanish Infanta, the daughter Elizabeth, and she's the daughter of the heir to the Spanish throne. So it made kind of a closer connection between France and Spain, which had typically been rivals. She also, like I said, hires Cardinal Richelieu as the king's chief advisor. Now, Cardinal Richelieu had a very clear outlook what he wanted. He wanted to make France a supreme power. He was very anti-Habsburg, so he wasn't so happy that this treaty wasn't in place with Spain, because he was very anti-Habsburg, and he wanted to campaign contain, Spain's power and contain Spain's influence. He was also very, very good at diplomacy. So Richelieu, and there's a picture of a young Louis XIII and an older Louis XIII. But Richelieu, getting back to him, was very, very good at diplomacy. So we know from the 30 Years' War that the French are backing the Swedish. So in 1631, he's giving money to Adolphus, the King of Sweden's army, while insisting, that Catholic Bavaria, which is in southern Germany, not be attacked, and that Catholics in conquered areas be allowed to practice their religion. So in the 30 Years' War, he's really kind of playing both sides. He's playing the side of the Protestants because of his anti-Habsburg attitude, but he's also a Catholic cardinal, and he doesn't want to see anything happen to the Catholics in the area. And also, left to his own devices, he would have started persecuting Protestants. He was not pro-Protestant. He just saw it as its own means to an end. So he was really good at diplomacy. He was very much someone who believed in a strong central government. Basically, the king was not really that into being king. So Louis XIII, even when he came of age, continued to let Richelieu make most of the decisions of state. So Richelieu really kind of establishes the whole concept of one law and that no one was above it. Disobedient nobles were imprisoned and even executed. The nobles hated him. Marie de Medici was very wary of him. It's kind of like almost like, who did I bring into this house? Because now I feel like he has too much power. So she, on her own, was not willing to place the larger interests of the state over her favorite nobles. She had, personal relationships with the nobles, and she was kind of weary of what Cardinal Richelieu was doing because he really cracked down very harshly on the nobles if he felt that they were getting out of line. He did start a campaign against the Huguenots because, like I said, he was not pro-Protestant. He was very anti-Protestant. And had he not had these other arrangements with the Swedish king and playing all these games with the 30 Years' War, he probably would have cracked down on the Huguenots a lot more harshly. But in 1629, royal armies began to conquer the major Huguenot cities. And then he set up what's called the Peace. I don't know how to say that in fancy French, but it denied the Protestants the rights to have fortified cities, separate political organizations, and an independent law court. So probably left to his own devices again, he probably would have revoked the Edict of Nantes, but his ties with Protestant powers really prevented him from doing anything of extreme intolerance. Because in 1635, he's fighting openly with the Swedish Lutherans against the Holy Roman Emperor's armies. He also, Richelieu was very good at employing arts and the printing press to defend his actions and explain them to the French people, his meaning of the reason of the state. He's the person really that kind of sets the precedent of using propaganda and spectacle to enhance the power of the crown. Richelieu's legacy, though, is a legacy of resentment of the monarchy by the nobles and the wealthy. They hated him. And so what he also did is he replaced local authorities like the parliaments and all these things that even Henry IV was trying to go after, and by replacing them with state agents. And what this did is it undermined the traditional position of the privileged groups in French society. So the nobles did not appreciate the lessening of power they saw as a result of Richelieu. Which is going to take us to this next question. Why did Mazarin lose control of the country? So Louis XIII dies young like his father. I don't exactly know how he dies, but it's not of a violent death like Louis IV. He's not assassinated, but he dies in 1643, Louis XIII. Louis XIV is only 5 years old. So a similar idea in that he leaves a very young son to rule. His mother, Anne of Austria, she leaves the government in control with Cardinal Mazarin. So Cardinal Mazarin is going to be kind of the one who's kind of ruling for, this very young Louis XIV. Louis XIV, by the way, is going to have one of the longest reigns. I think it's like 70-some-odd years, probably because he becomes king so young. But Mazarin continues the policy of centralization that Richelieu had continued. But because of the years of Richelieu's rule and how much the people resented, the nobles, resented this taking away of power, this produced a very large backlash. So and that's actually an image of a young Louis XIV. Yes, I know. That's a boy. They would dress him in dresses. That's another image of Mazarin. That's a little bit older Louis XIV. But in between 1649 to 1652, there is a series of rebellions that break out that are known as the Fronde. And what they are is it's the nobility and the townspeople, the people who had been targeted by these centralization policies under Richelieu and then Mazarin. It's a backlash against it. So they want to reverse the absolute monarchy. They want to preserve local autonomy. They don't like that, Henry IV started to weaken the power of the regional parliaments. Richelieu continued that policy with replacing local agents with people from, the state, and this resentment kind of welled up. So the Parliament of Paris is going to initiate the revolt, and the nobility is going to follow. And it's urged on by the wives of nobles Mazarin, who had imprisoned for treason. And for a time, the nobility was winning. And also for a time, Louis XIV is actually forced to go into exile. So Mazarin releases imprisoned princes and imprisoned nobles, in February of 1651. He gives in to the crowd. Him and Louis are forced to go into a short exile. And you can see a very frightened Louis XIV being, kind of secreting away. Now, this was a very pivotal moment in the young life of Louis XIV, because basically during the course of this rebellion, now first off, this is when the royal palace was still in the center of Paris. So the mob is going crazy in the streets. They actually break into the palace. They break into his room. They scare the crap out of this little boy. This is going to be one of the reasons why he really doesn't trust the people of Paris. This is going to be one of the reasons why eventually Louis XIV is going to move his principal residence to Versailles, which is 16 miles outside of Paris, because he doesn't trust the people of Paris. He doesn't trust the nobles, and it all kind of goes down to this kind of event that he lived through as a young boy. It was very traumatic to him. So him and Mazarin are forced into a short exile. They return in October of 1652, because the brief time when there was no king in France, basically the nobles were completely inefficient. It was complete anarchy. No one could agree with anything. So it wasn't like they were running a somewhat stable state. Basically, the people were kind of begging for the king back. So when Louis XIV does come back, he comes back to a strengthened monarchy, because it convinced the French people that the rule of a strong king was preferable to the rule of many regional powers, that it was better to have this centralized government. So this really set the stage for Louis later to be able to take more power, and the people being willing to follow it because they saw what had happened during the Fronde. So that leads us to this question: why was France more inclined to absolutism? So I want you to think about that, and I'll see you guys in class.